White Read by Whisper TTS Chapter 1 The Shattering Silence. The sun hovered low, its faint pink glow barely piercing the slate-gray clouds above the Antarctic ice. Aurora's light, a marvel of modern engineering, carved through the frigid waters, its steel hull groaning under the strain of shifting ice. Captain Elena Mitchell stood on the bridge, her posture rigid as she surveyed the desolate expanse. The bridge windows reflected her sharp, weathered features, a testament to years of commanding ships in hostile waters. Beneath her composed exterior, shadows of her past lingered, memories of the Ardent, her first ship lost to the Arctic, a tragedy she carried like a phantom. Trouble brewing, she murmured to herself, her instincts tingling. The rhythm of the engines shifted, a subtle change, but enough to draw her attention. She tightened her grip on the railing as a low groan echoed from the depths of the vessel, reverberating through the steel like an unspoken warning. "Elena!" Lucas Kane burst onto the bridge, his face flushed from the bitter cold. His voice cut through the gathering tension like a blade. "We've got a major issue in the engine room. I think it's a total systems failure." Before she could respond, Dr. Raj Patel appeared, his usual calm replaced with wide-eyed concern. Behind him, Sarah Hayes clutched a tablet, her knuckles white. "We've lost power across the board," Lucas continued, his voice tight with urgency. "Engines are dead. No heat, no communication. We're adrift." Elena's gut twisted, but her voice remained steady. "Sound the evacuation alarm. Raj, ready the team. Sarah, secure critical data. Lucas," she paused, meeting his eyes. "You're with me. Let's assess the damage." The bridge sprang into action. Elena's commands carried an edge of authority born from years of crisis management, but beneath the surface, her mind churned. This wasn't just an accident. Something deeper, something wrong, was at play. In the engine room, the stench of burning metal lingered. Lucas knelt beside a control panel, his hands trembling as he examined the wreckage. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered. His mind raced back to his early years, fixing broken heaters and radios in a rundown garage to help his family survive bitter winters. He prided himself on knowing machines better than people, but now, staring at the charred circuits, he felt powerless. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This wasn't a mechanical failure. Something external, maybe the ice, caused this." Elena's heart sank. "Can it be repaired?" "Not out here," Lucas replied, his tone grim. On deck, the icy wind howled like a living thing, gnawing through the thickest layers of clothing. The crew worked methodically, securing lifeboats and survival gear. Raj Patel took charge of the medical supplies, his thoughts drifting to his children back in Delhi. He had promised them he'd return with stories of Antarctic wonders. Now, he wondered if he'd broken that promise. Sarah struggled with her overloaded bag, her breath fogging the air as she muttered, "Every sample is worth its weight in gold." She refused to abandon her research, even if it meant slowing her pace. Above the chaos, Elena directed the evacuation, her steely gaze masking the storm within. She watched her crew descend onto the ice, their figures dwarfed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The ship groaned one final time, tilting as icy water rushed onto its lower decks. Aurora's light, once their fortress, was now a sinking tomb. As the crew huddled on the frozen expanse, a profound silence enveloped them. It wasn't peace. It was the oppressive quiet of a world untouched by humanity, where survival was a cruel gamble. Elena scanned the horizon, her mind grappling with an unsettling question. Was this the beginning of an accident, or something far worse? Chapter 2 The White Embrace. The Antarctic greeted them with an emptiness that defied comprehension. The wind, once a roaring beast, had stilled, leaving a profound silence that seemed to press on the crew's eardrums. The vast, featureless expanse stretched endlessly in all directions, a blank canvas of ice and snow, under a sky as pale as bone. "Stay close," Elena commanded, her voice sharp against the oppressive quiet. The crew trudged in single file, their sleds groaning under the weight of survival gear. Each step was a battle against the biting cold, the ice crunching like brittle glass beneath their boots. Elena led the way, her every decision calculated and deliberate. Behind her, Raj Patel carried the medical supplies, his thoughts drifting to the warmth of home. He could almost hear his daughter's laughter, a memory that cut through the cold like a knife. "Raj, how's the gear holding up?" Elena asked, her tone masking concern. "It'll last," he replied, though he wasn't sure if he meant the supplies or himself. Sarah Hayes, lagging slightly behind, adjusted the strap of her bag for the third time. Every fiber of her being protested the weight, but she refused to leave her research behind. Her mind raced with calculations. Every sample could hold insights into the ice's ancient history. "Worth every damn gram," she muttered under her breath, stumbling over a hidden mound of snow. Lucas Kane caught her arm, steadying her before she fell. "Careful," he said gruffly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Thanks," she muttered, not meeting his gaze. Lucas remained quiet, his thoughts locked on the ship's failure. He couldn't shake the image of the charred control panel, nor the gnawing suspicion that something unnatural had caused it. The group pressed forward, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Every step felt like a small victory against an indifferent foe. Elena's mind worked furiously, analyzing their dwindling resources and the encroaching cold. "We need shelter," Raj said after an hour of trudging. "Exposed like this, we won't last long." Elena nodded, glancing back at the team. She could see the exhaustion etched into their faces, the way their movements had grown sluggish. "Keep moving," she urged. "We'll find something." The Antarctic revealed its cruelty as the hours stretched on. The wind returned, a low, mournful howl that carried shards of ice like daggers. Visibility dropped, the horizon blending into a swirling void. "Stop!" Sarah cried suddenly, her voice cutting through the gale. The crew halted, their breaths heaving. Sarah pointed to a dark shape in the distance, barely visible through the snow. "What is it?" Raj asked, squinting. "Could be a rock formation," Sarah replied, "or something man-made." Elena's pulse quickened. She didn't dare hope, but the prospect of shelter was too vital to ignore. "Let's move, quickly." The dark shapes materialized into the remnants of a whaling station, half buried in ice and snow. Its skeletal walls leaned against the wind, their wood weathered and splintered by decades of abandonment. "Looks like it's been here for a century," Lucas muttered, his voice tinged with unease. The crew stepped cautiously inside. The air was bitterly cold, but the walls provided a merciful barrier against the howling wind. "Raj, check for structural stability," Elena ordered. "Lucas, see if there's anything useful in the equipment. Sarah, document everything." Sarah barely heard her, her eyes fixed on a tattered ledger frozen to the floor. She knelt to examine it, her gloved fingers brushing away a thin layer of frost. "What's that?" Raj asked, peering over her shoulder. "A record," Sarah murmured, her voice a mix of fascination and dread. "The whalers kept detailed logs, but some of these entries, they don't make sense." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, her voice sharp. Sarah hesitated. Descriptions of strange phenomena. Lights in the sky, equipment failures, crew disappearing without a trace. The air grew heavier, the weight of history pressing down on them. "Coincidence," Lucas muttered, his voice betraying a sliver of doubt. "Maybe," Sarah said, her eyes lingering on the brittle pages. "But we're not the first to be stranded here. And I don't think the last crew left voluntarily." The station, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a haunted relic. And as the wind howled outside, the crew couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely alone. Chapter 3. Fragile Coexistence. The whaling station groaned against the storm, its old timbers creaking like the lament of ghosts. The crew clustered inside the largest intact structure, a low, angular building that might have once housed the whalers' communal quarters. The air smelled faintly of decay and salt, mingling with the musty scent of weathered wood. Elena moved through the room with practiced efficiency, checking the walls for cracks and gaps that might let the biting cold seep in. Her flashlight beam swept across rusting tools, overturned furniture, and a pile of rotting ropes that looked like the twisted remnants of an old net. "This'll hold for the night," she announced, her voice firm. "Lucas, get that stove working. Raj, inventory the food and supplies. Sarah." She paused as she spotted Sarah still poring over the tattered ledger by the light of a flickering headlamp. "Sarah," Elena repeated, sharper this time. Sarah glanced up, her cheeks flushed from cold and focus. "Sorry, Captain, there's something odd here. Look." Elena crossed the room, kneeling beside Sarah. The pages of the ledger were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were legible enough. "January 1927, Sarah read aloud. "Crew reports strange lights over the ice, equipment malfunctions widespread, food supplies diminishing faster than expected, morale low." Lights? Elena asked, frowning. Sarah nodded. And it gets worse. Later entries mention men disappearing, tools breaking without cause, even hallucinations. It's like something was eroding their sanity. Elena's stomach tightened. Keep reading, but don't jump to conclusions. Right now, survival is our priority. Lucas Kane hunched over a rusted iron stove in the corner of the room, his hands raw and trembling. He'd found an old can of kerosene among the debris, and though it smelled off, it might be enough to start a flame. "Come on," he muttered, striking a match. The tiny flame sputtered to life, licking at the soaked kindling he'd packed into the stove. After a moment, the fire caught, and warmth began to spread through the room. "Good work," Elena said, giving him a rare nod of approval. Lucas didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment the Aurora's light had failed. He'd gone over every scenario in his head, every possible cause, but none of it made sense. It was as if the ship had been sabotaged by an invisible hand. Raj Patel sat on a broken crate, meticulously organizing their meager supplies. The food packs from the lifeboats were barely enough to sustain the group for a week, even with careful rationing. He sighed, the weight of responsibility pressing on him like the icy wind outside. "Raj?" Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. He looked up to see her holding the ledger, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Do you believe in collective madness?" she asked. Raj raised an eyebrow. "Like hysteria? Why?" "These whalers," she said, lowering her voice as if afraid the walls might hear. "They weren't just starving or cold, they started turning on each other. It's all in here. Accusations, fights, even murders." Raj glanced toward the others, who were too absorbed in their tasks to notice the conversation. "Isolation does strange things to people," he said quietly. "But we're not them, Sarah. Focus on what's real." As night fell, the crew gathered around the stove, its feeble heat doing little to combat the biting chill. The wind had risen again, rattling the walls like a predator testing the strength of its prey. Elena leaned forward, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "We'll rest tonight and move at first light. This place isn't safe." Lucas looked up from his tinkering with an old radio transmitter. "Safe or not, it might be our only chance. The storm isn't letting up, and if we don't find a way to signal for help," he trailed off, the implications hanging in the air. "Any luck with the transmitter?" Raj asked. Lucas shook his head. "The parts are ancient. I might be able to boost the signal, but it's going to take time." "Then you'll have it," Elena said firmly. The group lapsed into silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the relentless wind outside. Sarah stared at the ledger, her mind racing with the tales of madness and despair etched into its pages. "You think it's happening to us too, don't you?" Lucas asked, his voice low. Sarah blinked, startled. "What?" "The ledger," he said, gesturing toward it. "You think we're next?" She hesitated. "I don't know. But if those men were right, if something out here was driving them to the edge, we need to figure out what it was." "Or," Raj interjected, "we need to focus on surviving. Speculation won't help us find rescue." Elena raised a hand, silencing the argument before it could escalate. "Enough. We stick to the plan. Survival first, answers later." As the fire dwindled and the crew settled into uneasy rest, the storm outside grew fiercer, its howls almost resembling voices. Lucas lay awake, staring at the shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment, he thought he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, closing his eyes. But the feeling lingered, cold and unwelcome. Chapter 4: Vestiges of Salvation. The storm battered the whaling station through the night, its relentless force shaking the fragile walls and seeping icy drafts into every crevice. By morning, the world outside was a white void, the snowstorm having buried the landscape in fresh drifts. Elena was the first to stir, her years of discipline refusing to yield to exhaustion. She checked on the others, each of them bundled tightly in their sleeping bags near the dying embers of the stove. "Wake up," she called, her voice firm but soft enough not to alarm. "We've got work to do." The crew roused slowly, their faces pale and drawn from a night of restless dreams. Lucas was the last to rise, dark circles under his eyes betraying how little sleep he'd managed. "I heard something," he said quietly, glancing around the room. "During the night, footsteps." Raj frowned. "The storm was loud enough to make you imagine things. It's common in high-stress situations." It wasn't the wind, Lucas insisted, his voice taut. It was here, inside. Enough, Elena said sharply. We don't have the luxury of chasing shadows. Lucas, focus on the transmitter. The rest of us will secure the station and gather anything useful. The station's interior revealed its secrets reluctantly, the crew picking through decades of debris. Sarah found herself drawn to the ledger once more, flipping to the final entries. March 10th, 1927, she read aloud. Remaining crew reduced to 4, supplies gone, lights appeared again last night, closer this time. They're watching us, I can feel it. Her voice faltered as she traced the faded ink. What happened to them? Raj asked, standing nearby. Sarah turned the brittle page. The next entry was scrawled in hurried, uneven script. We're not alone. That was the last recorded entry. Lucas worked in a corner of the room, his tools spread out in organized chaos. The old transmitter was a relic from the mid-20th century, its metal casing corroded and its wires brittle. He focused on repairing the signal booster, his hands steady despite the chill that bit at his fingers. What's the status? Elena asked, crouching beside him. I've rigged a temporary power source using the stove's fuel, Lucas replied. It might be enough to get a signal out, but it's a gamble. Elena nodded, her expression unreadable. Take the gamble. It's all we've got. Raj and Sarah moved cautiously through another section of the station, searching for anything salvageable. They found rusting tools, fragments of rope, and broken crates that spoke of a once thriving operation. Look at this, Sarah said, holding up a small tarnished locket she'd found beneath a pile of debris. Raj took it, examining the faint etching on the surface. Inside was a photograph, barely visible through the tarnish, a woman and a child. A reminder of who they left behind, Raj said softly. Do you think they ever made it back? Sarah asked. Raj didn't answer. Elena gathered the crew as Lucas prepared to test the transmitter. The tension in the room was palpable, each of them knowing how much depended on this moment. Here goes nothing, Lucas muttered, flipping a switch. The transmitter crackled to life, emitting a low, staticky hum. Lucas adjusted the dials, his hands precise and deliberate. After a few moments, a faint signal emerged, a repeating series of tones. That's a distress beacon, Lucas said, his voice tinged with relief. It's weak, but it's something. Elena stepped forward, speaking into the microphone. Mayday, Mayday. This is Captain Elena Mitchell of the Aurora's Light. We are stranded in the Antarctic and in need of immediate assistance. Repeat, Mayday. The response was static at first, then a garbled voice broke through. Copy, Mayday, coordinates? Elena's breath caught, hope flickering for the first time in days. Transmitting coordinates now, she said, nodding at Lucas to send the data. The voice responded again, faint but discernible. Rescue, en route, hold position. The room erupted into cautious relief. For the first time, the crew allowed themselves to hope that salvation was within reach. That night, as the storm subsided, the crew huddled around the stove, their spirits lifted by the prospect of rescue. Raj shared stories of his children, his voice warm with longing. Sarah spoke of her research, her passion for uncovering the secrets of the natural world rekindled. Even Lucas allowed a faint smile as he described his plans to redesign a safer, more resilient ship. But as the others laughed and shared, Elena's gaze drifted to the walls, her instincts still on edge. The weight of the ledger's final words lingered in her mind. We're not alone. Outside, the Antarctic stretched vast and silent, the snow reflecting the cold light of the stars. And somewhere, beyond the edge of perception, something watched. Chapter 5, Ingenious Resolve. The Antarctic morning dawned with a fragile clarity, the storm's remnants reduced to wisps of snow carried on a gentle breeze. The whaling station stood in stark contrast to the blinding white, its dark, weathered timbers a reminder of humanity's fleeting claim on this hostile wilderness. Elena emerged from the building, her breath clouding the air as she surveyed the landscape. The endless ice stretched toward the horizon, but for the first time it seemed less daunting. Rescue was coming, or so they believed. Inside, Lucas was already back at work, fine-tuning the transmitter. The repeated tone of the distress beacon echoed faintly, a rhythmic assurance that their call for help still reached the world beyond. Sarah had returned to the ledger, her fascination with its entries bordering on obsession. She sat in a corner, her gloves carefully turning the fragile pages. Elena, she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet. The captain approached, her expression wary. What now? There's more, Sarah said, pointing to an entry that had gone unnoticed in the dim light the night before. March 12, 1927, she read aloud. He's back. We thought he was gone, but we heard him. The tapping, the voice. We thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It's him. Who's him? Elena asked, frowning. I don't know, Sarah admitted, but the entries after this, they stop abruptly. No sign of a final record. It's like they vanished. Elena's stomach tightened. She hated the idea of her crew getting sucked into the paranoia of men long dead, but the unease was undeniable. Raj, in the meantime, was sorting through the supplies they'd scavenged. Among the piles of rusted tools and rotting ropes, he discovered a sealed tin marked with faded letters, emergency rations. Finally, some good news, he muttered, prying it open. Inside were blocks of hardened biscuits and what appeared to be a tin of preserved meat. The food was decades old, but starvation had a way of lowering standards. He carried the tin to the group, holding it up like a trophy. Look what I found. Enough to stretch our rations another day or two. Lucas glanced up from his work, smirking. If we survive the taste, that is. Better than nothing, Raj said, his tone resolute. The day passed in tense monotony, each member of the crew focusing on their assigned tasks. Lucas continued tweaking the transmitter. Raj inventoried their dwindling resources, and Elena patrolled the station, her eyes constantly scanning for signs of danger. As night fell, they gathered again around the stove. The warmth was feeble, but the ritual provided a semblance of normalcy. We've made it this far, Elena said, her voice steady. Tomorrow, we'll set up flares in case the rescue team's visual search gets close. We're almost there. The night brought with it a renewed sense of unease. The storm had calmed, but the silence was heavier than before, as if the ice itself held its breath. Lucas sat apart from the others, staring at the transmitter. The rhythmic pulse of the distress beacon was steady, almost hypnotic. Then, suddenly, it stopped. What the hell? He muttered, adjusting the dials. The beacon crackled back to life, but the tone had changed. It was irregular, distorted, less a signal and more a series of erratic bursts. Elena, he called out, his voice sharp with alarm. The captain was at his side in seconds. What's wrong? The signal, it's not ours anymore, Lucas said, his hands trembling. What do you mean? Listen, he said, switching the transmitter to speaker mode. The sound that emerged wasn't static, it was rhythmic, almost melodic, like a distant hum layered with faint, indistinguishable whispers. The room fell silent as the crew gathered, their faces pale in the dim light. It's probably interference, Raj said, though his voice lacked conviction. Or something else, Sarah whispered, her eyes darting toward the ledger. That night, sleep eluded them all. The strange signal played on a loop in their minds, its unsettling cadence gnawing at their nerves. Elena lay awake, her hand resting on the flashlight beside her. The station creaked and groaned, its ancient timbers protesting against the weight of time and ice. And then she heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping coming from the far end of the building. She bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. Grabbing her flashlight, she moved cautiously, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered floor. Lucas? Raj? She called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty halls like a heartbeat. Elena, what are you doing? She turned to see Lucas, his face pale as he stood at the doorway. Did you hear that? She asked. Lucas nodded, his jaw clenched. Yeah, it's not just the wind. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. We need to stay together, Elena said, her voice firm despite the chill running down her spine. As they returned to the others, the feeling of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on them. Outside, the snow-covered expanse shimmered under the faint light of the moon, and in the distance, just beyond sight, something shifted. Chapter 6, Resonance and Dread. The crew awoke to a world as still as death, the Antarctic morning muted under a shroud of pale gray. The sky seemed unnervingly low, pressing down on the abandoned whaling station. The strange signal from the night before still haunted them, its irregular rhythm echoing in their minds like a melody they couldn't escape. Lucas sat hunched over the transmitter, dark circles under his eyes betraying another sleepless night. He twisted knobs and adjusted wires with methodical precision, muttering under his breath. "Elena," he called suddenly, his voice low but urgent. Elena crossed the room, her footsteps deliberate. "What is it?" Lucas gestured to the transmitter. "The signal. It's repeating, but there's something layered beneath it. A voice, maybe." "A voice?" He nodded grimly. "It's faint, distorted. I can clean it up, but I'll need more time." "Do it," Elena said, her tone clipped. "Whatever this is, we need to understand it." Raj and Sarah worked silently in another corner of the station, inventorying what little remained of their supplies. The emergency rations Raj had found were edible but far from palatable, and their water reserves were running dangerously low. "We need to find a way to melt more snow," Raj said, his voice heavy with fatigue. Sarah barely heard him, her focus on the ledger once more. She flipped through the brittle pages, searching for anything that might explain the events unfolding around them. "Here," she said, pointing to a passage. Raj leaned over, reading aloud. "March 15th, 1927. The lights returned last night, closer than ever. They're not just lights. They're searching, watching. We saw something. A shape, moving across the ice. It's not human." He straightened, his brow furrowed. "Do you think they saw something real? Or were they losing their minds?" Sarah closed the ledger with a soft thud. "I don't know. But whatever it was, they believed it." By midday, Lucas had isolated the faint voice buried within the signal. The crew gathered around the transmitter, tension thick in the air as he played the cleaned-up recording. At first, it was nothing but static. Then, a voice emerged, low, wavering, and barely intelligible. "Help, trapped, cold, not alone." The words sent a chill through the room, deeper than the Antarctic air ever could. "Is that a distress call?" Raj asked, his voice trembling. Lucas shook his head. "It's not our frequency. It's something else, something older." "Older?" Elena pressed. "The equipment I'm using is ancient, but even it shouldn't be picking up anything this degraded. This could have been broadcasting for decades, maybe longer." Sarah's gaze flicked to the ledger. "What if it's them? The whalers?" "That's impossible," Raj snapped, though his voice betrayed his unease. "Is it?" Sarah countered. Elena held up a hand, silencing them. "Speculation won't help us. Focus on what we know. We sent our distress call and rescue is on the way. This signal, whatever it is, doesn't change that." But her words felt hollow, even to herself. The afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. The crew busied themselves with tasks, securing the station, checking supplies, preparing flares, but the strange signal remained a constant presence, its haunting rhythm pulsing softly in the background. Lucas found himself drawn to the signal, its erratic tones and whispered words a puzzle he couldn't ignore. He spent hours tweaking the transmitter, desperate to extract more information. "Elena," he called again as the light outside began to fade. She joined him, her expression guarded. "I've enhanced the signal," Lucas said, his voice low. "There's something else, a second voice. Listen." He played the recording again, this time isolating the new layer. The voice was deeper, colder, and unmistakably angry. "Leave, leave now, before it's too late." The room fell silent, the weight of the words pressing down on them like a physical force. "What the hell does that mean?" Raj whispered. "It means we don't belong here," Sarah said, her face pale. Elena squared her shoulders, her voice firm despite the unease in her gut. "It doesn't matter what it means. We stay focused. This place has been abandoned for decades. Whatever happened here, it's over. We're getting out of here, and that's all that matters." That night, as the crew huddled around the stove, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The fire flickered weakly, as if struggling against an unseen force. Lucas stared at the transmitter, the signal now reduced to faint static. Sarah clutched the ledger tightly, her eyes darting to the shadows that danced on the walls. "Elena," Raj said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "What is it?" "I think we should move tomorrow. Signal or no signal, this place, it's wrong. It's like the walls are closing in." Elena nodded slowly. "We'll set out at first light, pack light, and be ready to move fast." As the others settled in for the night, Elena remained awake, her flashlight casting long beams across the room. Every creak of the walls, every whisper of the wind set her nerves on edge. And then it came again, the tapping. It was louder this time, deliberate and insistent, echoing through the station like a drumbeat. "Elena?" Lucas's voice came from the darkness, his silhouette barely visible. "You heard it too?" she asked, her voice of relief and dread. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer, "and it's coming from outside." They exchanged a glance, the unspoken question hanging between them. "Do we go out there?" Before they could decide, the tapping stopped, replaced by a long, mournful creak that seemed to reverberate through the very ice beneath their feet. "Elena," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible, "we need to leave, now." Chapter 7. The Ice Whispers. The Antarctic dawn broke with a pale, listless light, barely illuminating the barren expanse. The storm had passed, but its remnants lingered in the icy winds that clawed at the whaling station. Inside, the crew prepared to leave, their movements brisk and tense, as if the station itself was urging them out. Elena paced near the entrance, her mind racing. The tapping from the night before haunted her, its deliberate rhythm too human to be the wind, too ominous to be ignored. "Everyone ready?" she called out, her voice sharper than intended. Lucas, standing by the transmitter, hesitated. "Captain, before we leave, I need to check something." Elena frowned. "We don't have time for detours." "Just 1 minute," he insisted, his eyes darting to the radio. The signal changed again overnight. "Lucas, it's not just noise anymore," he interrupted. "It's coordinates." The room fell silent. "What kind of coordinates?" Raj asked, stepping forward. Lucas gestured to a notebook filled with hastily scribbled numbers. "They point to a location about 2 miles from here. It's not on any map, but whatever's broadcasting this wants us to find it." "Whatever" is the key word, Sarah muttered, clutching the ledger to her chest. Elena's jaw tightened. "We don't split up. If we're going anywhere, we go together." Raj looked uneasy. "Do we even know if rescue is still coming?" Elena hesitated. The truth was, she didn't know. The distorted transmissions and ominous signals had shaken her faith in the reliability of their lifeline. 2 miles, Lucas said, his voice low. "It's worth a look. What if it's shelter, or even another transmitter?" Against her better judgment, Elena nodded. "Pack light. We move fast and stick together. If we don't find anything, we head back and wait for rescue." The ice crunched beneath their boots as they set out, the coordinates guiding them toward the unknown. The endless white expanse was disorienting, the horizon blending seamlessly with the sky. Lucas led the way, his handheld GPS clutched tightly in one hand. The signal pulsed faintly on the screen, a digital beacon in a world that felt increasingly surreal. "Do you feel that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Feel what?" Raj replied, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "The silence," she said. "It's too quiet." Raj shrugged. "It's Antarctica. What did you expect?" But Sarah wasn't convinced. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it felt alive, like the ice itself was listening. After an hour of trudging through the snow, they reached the coordinates. At first, they saw nothing but more ice and rock. "Are you sure this is the spot?" Elena asked, her voice edged with frustration. Lucas checked the GPS again. "This is it." Sarah scanned the area, her eyes narrowing. "Over there," she said, pointing to a ridge partially buried in snow. The crew approached cautiously, their breaths quickening as they uncovered what lay beneath, a large metallic structure embedded in the ice. It was angular and alien, its surface covered in strange etchings that shimmered faintly in the weak sunlight. "What is this?" Raj asked, his voice trembling. Sarah crouched beside it, running her gloved fingers over the markings. "It's not natural, and it's not from any whaling station." Elena's stomach churned. "Is it a beacon? A trap?" Lucas knelt beside Sarah, examining the structure. "It looks old, really old, but the signal, it's coming from inside." The crew worked quickly, clearing away the snow to reveal an opening in the structure. It was narrow, just large enough to crawl through. "I don't like this," Raj said, shaking his head. "We don't know what's in there." "And we won't know unless we look," Lucas replied, already positioning himself to enter. "Wait," Elena said. "We all go, or no one does. We stick together." With flashlights in hand, they descended into the opening, their movements slow and deliberate. The air inside was warmer than expected, heavy with a metallic tang that set their nerves on edge. The passage led to a central chamber, its walls lined with glowing panels that pulsed faintly in time with the signal. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which sat a crystalline object that seemed to hum with energy. "Is this what's been broadcasting?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with awe. Lucas approached cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing over the object. It has to be. But what is it? Elena's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her feet refused to move. The object seemed to pull at them, its faint hum growing louder, resonating in their very bones. "Don't touch it," she warned, but her voice felt distant, drowned out by the object's overwhelming presence. Raj stepped back, his breathing shallow. "We need to get out of here, now." Before anyone could respond, the object emitted a sharp pulse of light, blinding them momentarily. When their vision cleared, the chamber felt different, larger, darker, colder. The glowing panels had dimmed, and the hum had transformed into a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from all directions. "We shouldn't have come here," Sarah whispered, clutching the ledger like a talisman. The walls of the chamber began to shift, the etchings on their surface writhing as if alive. "Out," Elena commanded, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Now." The crew scrambled back through the passage, the hum growing louder with each passing second. As they emerged onto the ice, the structure behind them shuddered violently, its metallic surface cracking and folding in on itself until it disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but a smooth expanse of snow. The silence returned, heavier than before. The crew stood motionless, their breaths heaving in the cold air. "What just happened?" Raj asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. In the distance, a faint sound broke the stillness, a low, rhythmic tapping, growing louder with each beat. Elena turned, her eyes scanning the horizon. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. "We keep moving," she said finally, her voice shaking, "and we don't look back." Chapter 8, Beneath the Surface. The tapping followed them. It wasn't constant, but intermittent, drifting on the icy wind like a predator testing its prey. No matter how far they trudged, the sound remained, never close enough to identify, but always too near to ignore. The crew marched in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. The snow beneath their boots crunched with a rhythmic monotony that matched the relentless tapping, creating a dissonant harmony that gnawed at their nerves. "Elena," Raj said, breaking the silence. His voice was strained, his eyes darting to the featureless horizon. "What if we're walking in circles? What if we're not getting away from whatever that was?" Elena paused, scanning the expanse with her binoculars. The landscape was a barren sea of white, indistinguishable from any other stretch of the Antarctic. "We're not," she said firmly, though she wasn't entirely sure. "The coordinates on the GPS are shifting. We're making progress." "To where?" Sarah asked, her voice brittle. She clutched the ledger tightly, her knuckles white under her gloves. "Rescue? Another trap? Or just more ice?" Elena turned to face them, her expression hard. "We don't stop. We don't argue. We keep moving." The hours dragged on, the sun a pale disk that offered neither warmth nor hope. The tapping grew louder, its rhythm quickening as if mocking their futile march. Lucas fell behind, his exhaustion evident in his sluggish steps. Elena slowed, matching his pace. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded weakly, though his face told a different story. "Just tired. That thing, whatever it was, it's messing with my head." Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep going. Don't think about it. We'll get through this." He gave her a faint, hollow smile. "You really believe that?" She didn't answer. By mid-afternoon, the landscape began to change. Jagged ice formations jutted from the snow like frozen waves, their sharp edges glinting in the weak sunlight. The crew weaved through the maze of ice, the tapping now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "No," Raj replied quickly, too quickly. "Yes, you do," she shot back, her voice rising. "Quiet," Elena hissed. "Stay focused." They pressed on, the whispers growing louder, more distinct. Words began to form, fragmented and nonsensical. Lost, cold, not alone. As they rounded a particularly large ice formation, Sarah froze. "There," she said, pointing. Ahead of them, partially buried in the snow, was a structure, a low, domed shape that seemed impossibly smooth and unnatural. "What now?" Raj muttered, his voice thick with dread. Elena approached cautiously, her hand resting on the flare gun holstered at her side. The dome was made of the same material as the object they had discovered earlier. Metallic, etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly, even in the dim light. "Another one?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Elena didn't answer. Instead, she examined the structure, her breath fogging the air. There was no obvious entrance, but the symbols seemed to pulse faintly, drawing her closer. "This isn't real," Sarah murmured, clutching the ledger as if it could protect her. "None of this is real." "Then why does it feel so real?" Lucas shot back, his voice sharp with fear. Before Elena could decide their next move, the ground beneath them trembled. It was subtle at first, a low vibration that seemed to originate from the dome itself. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the ice split open, sending the crew tumbling to the ground. "Elena!" Raj shouted, his voice panicked. "I'm here," she called back, scrambling to her feet. The dome had sunk into the ice, leaving behind a gaping chasm. From the darkness below, a cold, blue light emanated, illuminating the crew's pale, terrified faces. "What is that?" Lucas whispered, peering into the abyss. The whispers returned, louder now, forming a chorus that seemed to rise from the depths. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" "Back away," Elena commanded, her voice firm despite the pounding in her chest. But before they could retreat, the light intensified, and the ground around the chasm began to crumble. "Run!" Elena shouted. The crew scrambled away, the ice collapsing behind them in a cascade of snow and shards. They didn't stop until the whispers faded, replaced by the familiar howl of the Antarctic wind. When they finally collapsed in exhaustion, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the ice. "What was that?" Raj asked, his voice shaking. "Another trap," Sarah said bitterly. "Or another warning." "Warning for what?" Lucas snapped. "We didn't do anything. We didn't ask to be here." Elena remained silent, her mind racing. The whispers, the tapping, the structures, they weren't coincidences. Something in the ice wanted them gone. Or worse, it wanted them to stay. That night, as they huddled together for warmth, the tapping returned, louder and closer than ever. "Do you think they'll find us?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Elena didn't answer. She didn't know if she believed rescue was coming anymore. Outside, the Antarctic stretched vast and silent, but the crew was no longer alone. Chapter 9. The Abyss Beckons. The tapping was relentless now, pounding through the icy air like a heartbeat. It no longer came from the distance. It surrounded them, echoing from the ice formations and the vast emptiness beyond. The crew huddled together, their breath forming plumes in the frigid air. The snowstorm had returned, obscuring the horizon and further trapping them in the white abyss. The temperature seemed to plummet with each passing minute, leaching the heat from their bodies and the resolve from their spirits. "Elena," Raj whispered, his voice trembling. "We can't keep moving like this. We need to stop." "We can't stop," Elena replied, her voice firm but strained. "Stopping means freezing to death. We keep moving until we find higher ground or rescue finds us." "Rescue?" Sarah spat bitterly. "Do you even believe that anymore? Or are we just waiting for whatever's out here to finish us off?" Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. As they trudged forward, Lucas walked slightly ahead, his GPS flickering weakly in his gloved hand. The coordinates from the previous day were gone, replaced by a blank screen that occasionally displayed strange symbols he couldn't decipher. "It's broken," he muttered, shaking the device. "It's not broken," Sarah said from behind him. "It's interference. Something's messing with it, just like it's messing with us." Lucas glanced back, his face pale. "You think this is deliberate?" "I think we're being guided," she said, clutching the ledger tightly. "Guided where?" Raj asked, his voice laced with fear. No one answered. Hours passed in strained silence, each step heavier than the last. The snowstorm howled around them, the wind cutting through their insulated clothing like knives. Their exhaustion was palpable, their movements sluggish and disoriented. Then suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. "Elena, stop!" Lucas shouted, holding up a hand. The group froze, their breaths shallow as they watched the snow in front of them crack and sink. Beneath the fragile surface, a gaping crevasse yawned wide, its depths glowing faintly with the same eerie blue light they had seen the day before. "What is that?" Raj whispered, stepping back. "Another one of those structures?" Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked confidence. Elena stepped cautiously to the edge, peering into the chasm. The light pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, and deep within the shadows she thought she saw movement, shapes shifting in the darkness. "We're leaving," she said firmly. "Now." As they turned to retreat, the snow behind them erupted in a cascade of ice and debris. The crew stumbled, falling to their knees as the ground beneath them buckled and cracked. From the shattered ice, a figure emerged, a tall, angular silhouette wreathed in the same blue light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form impossibly thin and its limbs unnaturally long. "What is that?" Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. The figure stepped closer, the light around it intensifying. Its surface was smooth and metallic, etched with symbols similar to those they had seen on the structures. But its face, or what passed for a face, was blank, devoid of features. "It's not human," Raj whispered, his voice trembling. "Run," Elena commanded, pulling Sarah to her feet. The crew bolted, their boots slipping on the icy surface as they fled into the storm. The figure didn't follow immediately, but the tapping resumed, louder and faster, as if mocking their desperation. They ran until their legs burned and their lungs felt like they would burst. When they finally stopped, collapsing into the snow, the tapping had faded into the distance. "What was that?" Lucas gasped, clutching his knees. Elena shook her head, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "I don't know, and I don't care. We're getting out of here." Sarah stared back the way they had come, her face pale and stricken. "It wasn't alone." "What?" Raj asked, his voice sharp. "There were more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the crevasse, I saw them moving." A heavy silence fell over the group. Night fell quickly, the storm easing just enough to reveal a faint glow on the horizon. At first they thought it might be rescue, a flare perhaps, or the lights of a helicopter. But as they drew closer, the glow grew brighter, taking on the same cold blue hue they had come to dread. "It's not rescue," Lucas said grimly, his voice devoid of hope. Elena gripped her flare gun tightly, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. "We don't stop, keep moving." But as they approached the source of the light, it became clear that they weren't walking toward safety. A massive structure loomed before them, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. The symbols etched into it pulsed in unison, creating a rhythm that matched the tapping. The entrance yawned wide, dark and inviting. "It's calling us," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "No," Elena said firmly. "We're not going in there." But as the crew stood frozen, the ground beneath them began to quake. The tapping intensified, vibrating through their bodies until they could no longer stand. The last thing Elena saw before the light consumed them was the silhouette of another figure emerging from the structure, its form impossibly tall and beckoning. The next morning, the Antarctic was silent again. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, undisturbed expanse of snow. The whaling station stood empty, its walls creaking softly in the wind. Of the crew there was no trace, only faint rhythmic taps that echoed through the ice, fading into the endless white abyss. Epilogue. Echoes in the ice. Months later, a research vessel, Endurance 2, cut through the frigid waters near the last known coordinates of the aurora's light. The expedition had been dispatched to investigate the disappearance, spurred by faint, intermittent distress signals that had baffled communications specialists for weeks. Dr. Evelyn Rourke, the lead scientist, stood on the bridge, her eyes scanning the endless white horizon. She had read the reports, heard the whispers among her crew, stories of strange signals, of lights in the ice, and of tapping that haunted the cold air. She dismissed most of it as hysteria, superstition bred in isolation. Approaching the site, the navigator announced. The vessel slowed as they neared a stretch of jagged ice formations. At the center stood the remains of the whaling station, its weathered timbers leaning precariously, as if bowing under the weight of its secrets. Evelyn led a small team onto the ice, the bitter wind biting at their exposed skin. They moved cautiously, their boots crunching over the pristine snow. "No signs of the crew," one of the researchers said, scanning the area with a handheld device. "They wouldn't still be here," Evelyn replied, her tone clipped. "Focus on finding the source of the signal." Inside the station, the air was still and heavy, the faint scent of decay lingering like a ghost. Evelyn's flashlight illuminated rusted tools, overturned furniture, and a pile of supplies frozen in time. Then she saw it, the ledger, its brittle pages splayed open on a table. "What's this?" she murmured, picking it up carefully. The writing was faint but legible. The final entry sent a chill through her. "We are not alone. We never were." "Dr. Rourke," one of the researchers called from the doorway, "you need to see this." They led her outside to the edge of a freshly exposed crevasse. Peering down, Evelyn saw the faint glow of blue light, pulsing rhythmically like the beat of a heart. "It's been transmitting a signal," the researcher explained. "But the source, it's unlike anything we've seen before." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Equipment down there? Possibly. But whatever it is, it's massive. Get the winches," she ordered. "We're going down." The descent into the crevasse was slow and tense, the cold seeping into their bones despite their protective gear. The light grew brighter as they neared the bottom, illuminating a smooth, half-metallic surface etched with intricate symbols. "What is this?" Evelyn whispered, running her gloved hand over the strange markings. "It's not man-made," one of the researchers said, his voice trembling. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the chamber. At the center stood a pedestal, identical to the one described in the missing crew's distress logs. Atop it sat the crystalline object, humming faintly. Evelyn felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, her curiosity overriding her caution. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface. "Don't touch it!" one of the researchers shouted. But it was too late. The chamber erupted in blinding light, the hum transforming into a deafening roar. The walls began to shift, the symbols writhing like living things. The researchers screamed as the floor splintered beneath them, and a sudden, suffocating silence fell. When Evelyn opened her eyes, she was no longer in the chamber. She was standing on the surface of the ice, alone. The Endurance 2 was gone, its tracks erased as if it had never existed. The whaling station stood in the distance, its silhouette hazy and insubstantial. Then she heard it, the tapping. It was closer now, louder, reverberating through her very bones. She turned, her heart pounding. Figures emerged from the white, their forms impossibly tall and featureless, their metallic skin shimmering with the same blue light. They moved with eerie grace, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Evelyn stumbled backward, her breath hitching as they surrounded her. One of them stepped forward, its blank face tilting as if to observe her. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a rhythmic tapping that resonated in her mind. "You have come too far." Before she could scream, the figures closed in, their light engulfing her. Weeks later, satellite images showed the area undisturbed, the whaling station reduced to rubble by shifting ice. No trace of the Endurance 2, its crew, or the Aurora's light was ever found. But for years to come, faint signals would occasionally be picked up by radios across the globe. Rhythmic taps layered with faint whispers. Lost, cold, not alone. And in the icy silence of the Antarctic, the snow fell, burying the secrets of the white abyss once more.